Welcome to Asianomics. I'm your host, Alex. The World Trade Organization has sided with the European Union in the conflict over Indonesia's ban on nickel ore exports. Today, we'll explore why the WTO's decision to force Indonesia to export its raw material is seen as a modern-era colonialism. Let's start with some background on Indonesia's controversial nickel ore ban. Before the ban, Indonesia was the world's largest exporter of nickel, an essential metal in the production of stainless steel and electric vehicle batteries. Nickel is a key component that powers the growing clean energy industry, making it increasingly valuable in the global market. In 2019, the Indonesian government made a bold move by banning the export of raw nickel ore. The decision aimed to encourage domestic processing of the raw ore into higher-value products, such as nickel pig iron and other refined metals used in manufacturing. This step was part of Indonesia's larger plan to transform the country into a key player in the electric vehicle market and create new economic opportunities. However, this strategic move was not welcomed by the European Union. EU authorities argued that Indonesia's ban on nickel ore exports is illegal and creates an unfair disadvantage for European steel producers. They believe that this policy limits their access to the much-needed raw materials, which in turn could harm their own steel industry. In response to the ban, the EU has taken the matter to the WTO, claiming that Indonesia's policy violates international trade laws. Now, let's explore the Indonesian perspective on the nickel ore ban. According to the Indonesian government, the ban on nickel ore exports is a necessary step towards achieving the country's economic development goals. By shifting focus to domestic production and attracting foreign investment, Indonesia aims to build a complete nickel supply chain, from mining and extraction to processing into metals and chemicals, and eventually to producing electric vehicles. Indonesia has already made significant progress towards this objective, with several large-scale projects currently underway. These efforts reflect the government's desire to leverage the country's natural resources to create a self-sufficient and resilient economy. The Indonesian government believes that by retaining the processing of raw materials within the country, it can increase the value added of its exports and create new job opportunities. Furthermore, this policy could help Indonesia shift from being a mere exporter of raw materials to a provider of high-value finished products. By prioritizing domestic production and processing, Indonesia can also ensure greater control over its resources and avoid over-reliance on foreign buyers. The Indonesian perspective on this issue is also linked to a broader vision of economic development that emphasizes self-sufficiency and promoting domestic industry. This is particularly important given the country's recent history of economic turmoil and its status as a developing country. Now let's take a look at the European Union's perspective on the nickel ore ban. The EU views Indonesia's ban on nickel ore exports as a significant threat to its steel industry, which is already struggling with a 10-year low in stainless steel production. The EU argues that Indonesia's export restrictions on raw materials, including nickel and iron ore, are illegal and create an unfair advantage for Indonesian steel producers. In addition to its WTO challenge, the EU has already imposed duties on hot-rolled flat stainless steel from Indonesia and launched an investigation into cold-rolled stainless products. These actions demonstrate the EU's determination to protect its own economic interests and competitiveness in the global market. The EU's opposition to Indonesia's nickel ore ban also highlights the challenge of balancing the interests of resource-rich countries with those of trade partners in the global economy. As demand for key raw materials such as nickel continues to grow, access to these resources becomes increasingly vital for maintaining competitiveness and economic growth. However, the EU's stance has been met with criticism from some who view it as a form of neo-colonialism. They argue that by insisting on access to Indonesia's raw materials, the EU is perpetuating a system that exploits developing countries for the benefit of developed nations. These critics point out that Indonesia has the right to develop its own industries and control the use of its natural resources. This dispute between Indonesia and the EU goes beyond just nickel ore. It's a battle of two distinct development models. On one hand, Indonesia wants to leverage its natural resources to build domestic industries and reduce its reliance on exports. On the other hand, the EU wants to maintain access to raw materials to ensure the survival of its own industries. Indonesia's vision of development is based on a self-reliant, export-oriented economic model, where the country exports high value-added products, rather than just raw materials. By processing and manufacturing these resources locally, Indonesia can generate more jobs, increase technology transfer, and move up the value chain. This approach can help the country to reduce its dependence on primary commodities and increase its economic resilience. The European Union's development model is based on a different set of priorities, focused on maintaining access to raw materials and markets for its industrial products. For decades, the EU has relied on resource-rich countries to provide the raw materials needed for its industries, particularly in the steel sector. However, this dependency has left the EU vulnerable to supply disruptions and price fluctuations. Thus, the EU views Indonesia's nickel ore ban as a threat to its industry and argues that it's illegal under international trade laws. However, from the Indonesian perspective, the ban on nickel ore exports is part of a larger strategy to develop a complete nickel supply chain domestically. By building processing facilities within the country, Indonesia can create new job opportunities and promote local technology transfer and innovation, ultimately benefiting the country's economic growth. So is there a middle ground that can be reached in this dispute, or is it an inevitable collision between different visions of economic growth and progress? The WTO has backed the European Union in its dispute with Indonesia over the country's nickel ore export ban. Their decision has significant implications for both parties involved. The WTO ruled that Indonesia's export ban on nickel ore is inconsistent with global trade rules and disadvantages other WTO members, including the EU. This means that Indonesia will be required to allow nickel ore exports again, which could negatively impact the country's long-term development plans. The WTO's decision has raised concerns about modern-era colonialism, where powerful countries use international trade rules to restrict the development of resource-rich nations. Critics argue that the WTO's decision is biased in favor of developed countries and ignores the right of resource-rich nations to manage their resources and chart their economic growth. This decision also raises questions about the fairness of the WTO's rules and regulations. Indonesia has accused the EU of using double standards, pointing to the EU's previous ban on Indonesian crude palm oil sales in EU territory. Indonesia argues that it's unfair for the EU to ban Indonesian CPO while forcing the country to export its nickel ore, which will be processed and manufactured in other countries, creating more value-added products and jobs for foreign workers. The WTO's decision highlights the challenges faced by resource-rich countries in the global economy. It raises questions about the balance between the rights of resource-rich countries and the interests of developed countries in accessing raw materials. It also highlights the need for greater cooperation and dialogue between developed and developing countries to address the root causes of these conflicts. The WTO's decision to back the European Union in its dispute with Indonesia over nickel ore exports has significant implications for the global economy. The case highlights the challenges faced by resource-rich countries in the global trade system and the potential risks of modern-era colonialism. One of the potential impacts of this case is on other resource-rich countries, like Congo, which has the largest supply of cobalt, another critical component in electric vehicles. Cobalt is essential for the production of lithium-ion batteries, making it a crucial resource for the global transition to clean energy. Like Indonesia's nickel ore, cobalt is also vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation by developed countries. The global demand for cobalt has already led to human rights abuses and environmental degradation in countries like Congo. The case of Indonesia's nickel ore export ban demonstrates how developed countries can use international trade rules to restrict the development of resource-rich countries and control access to critical resources. If the WTO's decision to back the EU in its dispute with Indonesia becomes a precedent, it could have a chilling effect on other resource-rich countries, potentially slowing down their development and progress. It could also undermine the principle of economic sovereignty, where countries have the right to manage their resources and determine the pace and manner of their economic development. However, there are also opportunities for resource-rich countries to use this case as a rallying point for greater cooperation and collaboration. By working together, resource-rich countries can leverage their collective bargaining power to demand fairer trade rules and promote sustainable resource management practices. This approach could help to promote greater economic equality and reduce the risks of modern-era colonialism. If you like this video, you should watch our previous video about the potential consequences of countries abusing their privileges.